Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Tobin. I'm Vice President for Policy and Preservation here at the Preservation League of New York State. And welcome to our webinar, part of our Future of Preservation series. Today's topic is Heritage Buildings and the Art of Creating Healthy Environments. And we're really excited to welcome Walter Sadovic Architects, Modern Ruins and Landmark Facilities Group. So I am going to, we are also very appreciative to our sponsors. These programs are supported by the Peggy and Roger Gary Charitable Trust. So we're so appreciative of the Gary Charitable Trust for their support of this program and others. And so a little bit about the Preservation League. We are New York statewide historic preservation nonprofit. We focus on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation and community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. We work through all of New York's 62 counties, and we are through a variety of programs. We have technical services, we have grant programs, revolving loan fund. We spotlight endangered properties through our biennial 7 to Save. We support effective local, state, and federal public policies and preservation policies through our governmental advocacy. And then we recognize and celebrate excellence in historic preservation through our annual awards program. Today, we have 4 speakers with us, and we're so delighted. So today's topic on heritage buildings and the art of creating healthy environments is so timely and was really, I think, perhaps created because of the situation that we're all in right now, and really learning, recognizing the importance of healthy environments and how our buildings can create and support emotional, psychological, and physical well-being while operating more efficiently. And we have a really fabulous lineup of speakers today. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce them. Some of them I've known for many years. Walter Sadovic is the principal and CEO of Modern Ruins, and his work and the firm have really been at the vanguard of infusing heritage sites with green building approaches and ideologies, and while maintaining a connection to community and context. And Jill, also principal at Modern Ruins and Walter Sadovic Architects, sets an incredibly high bar for open exchange of ideas among peers, her clients, constituents, and her projects really embody the essence of sustainable preservation. Both Walter and Jill are fellows of the Association for Preservation Technology, and Walter is also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. And then we have Thomas Newbold, who's the president of Landmark Facilities Group, which is an engineering firm that specializes in the design of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection systems for architecturally significant cultural, commercial, and educational applications. And Landmark Facilities Group, for decades that I've worked with historic, cultural, and commercial buildings, has been really one of the go-to mechanical engineering firms, if not the go-to mechanical engineering firm for these issues. And last but not least, and I'm introducing them in out of order of speakers, but in order that you see them on your screen today, is Troy Simpson. And Troy is the Director of Research and Operations at 3x3. He's a visiting instructor at Pratt Institute and a doctoral candidate in environmental psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And he previously had conducted research at the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions at Columbia University's Earth Institute, where he worked as a green building and policy advisor. So this is a blue ribbon panel today that you're going to hear from. And we are so excited to, we are so excited to have you here with us today. And I just want to say, if you like this program, please consider joining the Preservation League and supporting this work. PreserveNYS.org is our website, and that's also where you can find us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, Preserve NYS. You can subscribe to our e-news. Join us next Thursday for our Pillar Awards. It's virtual this year, as most things are, and it's free and open to the public, but you do need to register, please. So we hope that you'll join us as we honor some fabulous awardees. And then our monthly book club will meet again on Thursday, May 13th, with a discussion of Matthew Desmond's Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. One thing in terms of how things will go today, if you have questions or discussion, please drop them in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll have time for discussion at the end of today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and we will begin. And I believe that we are going to begin with Walter. And I will introduce him. I'm not sure if he's going to screen share or if we're going to have Katie screen share. Katie Peace is our communications director, and she is here with us today too.
I'm going to screen share.
Okay, great. All right, Walter, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Katie, and to everyone who's joining. Oops. We're particularly honored whenever we have an opportunity to collaborate with the League, who in their own right are so formidable in this profession that we love so much. This is a timely topic, and it's an evolving topic, as Erin rightly points out. Unsolicited, a couple of weeks ago, after we've already formed the program, this fell on my desk, an article that people gave up on the flu pandemic measures in 1918 prematurely, and they paid a price for that. And it really underscored the issues that we're facing, that this track we're following relative to the pandemic and to reopening is far from linear. In fact, it's much more appropriate to consider it a revolving or even circular track that we're on, and that all of our progress tends to retrace well-worn steps that have been taken in the past. Now, this is good news for people involved in heritage buildings, and I can explain why. That up until World War II, heritage buildings and our societies as they evolved did find ways to keep people healthy for literal millennia, for over 7,000 years of recorded history, through myriad pandemics and maladies that have affected us. The elements within our heritage buildings, the DNA of those buildings to protect us and to keep us safe, still exist. So this offers an opportunity to rediscover and to re-engage those elements that are so often overlooked. The second issue that's crucially important globally is that what's healthy for people is healthy for buildings. So as practicing preservation professionals, we can actually hit every mark at the same time by following the precepts that govern our response to pandemic. And finally, healthy environments contribute to emotional well-being. So very much a three-dimensional response to how we interact with our communities and our buildings. So all of this is good news. And I'll explain why it's even better news as time goes on. First, a couple of points of definition relative to whether or not we're actually evolving through this. We will never likely be post or past pandemics. We will be post-pandemic. And through the process, we'll learn to manage, but probably never eliminate the maladies that are affecting us. And when we speak of pandemics in the current tense, we're really speaking about COVID-19. As you'll see momentarily, there is an entire panoply of maladies, both virulent, bacteriological, parasites, and so forth that affect us and will likely continue. Dr. Fauci, who is an adorable and brilliant scientist and director, has been providing us with guidance that is time-honored. Masking, washing hands, physical distancing, avoiding congregant settings, being outdoors whenever possible. These are nothing new. In fact, these are elements of our response mechanisms that have been devised by people and societies literally thousands of years ago. As another pitcher, actually catcher, who throws out the first ball, Yogi Berra would say, it's deja vu all over again. And why is that? Well, there are depictions early on, this Egyptian carving indicating Ramses III capture of the Philistines who were traveling from Crete. While Ramses thought he may have had the good fortune, what he also captured was the bubonic plague and tularemia, or rabbit fever, which created a vast pestilence and plague for the Egyptians, written about some 500 years later in one of the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah, in Deuteronomy, where it says, I will send against them consuming pestilence and deadly plague. This depicts an actual event that occurred. These are a non-exhaustive list of maladies that have affected us. These are pandemics that have affected us over thousands of years of recorded history, and they are continuing to the current day, including bubonic plague. Of all of these, the only one to date that's been eradicated is smallpox. All the others are very, very much alive and very much with us. They will continue to be with us. In the past, there was a certain resignation that the fact that these things were affecting us couldn't be avoided. There was belief in miasma that, that issues evolved or originated from spirits. And of course, there was medicine. The reason that we're probably not going to get past it is because we have a combination of issues that create condition ripe for continued pandemics. One, suppressed immune systems through the likes of chemotherapy and certain drugs that we take, high rates of comorbidity that have been affecting us, global climate change and dissolved barriers among habitats that allow us to coexist much more closely with animal and other populations that we hadn't in the past. Population tipping point, over 7 billion people, which by definition is non-sustainable, and increasing globalization. Not surprisingly, perhaps, there have both been responses to containing these maladies. Our first smallpox inoculations actually occurred 200 years before the current era, before Christ. Our first hazmat suit, which is this bird-like affair, was devised in 1630. That wasn't to scare off potential patients. It actually, that long beak was stuffed with cloth that was infused with aromatics like lavender to keep the medical care provider from collapsing from the stench of the patients that he or she was treating. We had our first smallpox vaccine in Great Britain in the late 18th century. And with every advance, there's been resistance, no different than today. Anti-vaxxers, people that believed it was an outrage on our personal liberties. In the 14th century, we began to see our first humanitarian collective approach to treating pandemics. And this occurred in Italy, in chapels that were an integral part of communities. Different than leper colonies that were sort of sublimated to the outer fringes of our communities and villages. It was understood that people who were afflicted needed to be separated from the general population, but they were separated with abundant palliatives, including those things that were readily available and known to be somewhat curative: light, air, clean water, and care. This continued in our collective consciousness actually for hundreds of years in Robert Owen's plans for what was intended to be a utopian community in southern Indiana, New Harmony, and about 30 years before germ theory evolved. His compound did all of the same things that the quarantine hospitals did in 14th century Italy, but in a more evolved and very elegant fashion. This was designed for communities, separating out the population, actually separating potential pestilence, where the food and garbage came in and out. People were separated by actual different levels, so that there was not an exchange where problems might be able to erupt within the community. All of the burning that took place had high smokestacks, and the smoke was drifting into the atmosphere. 30 years later, a generation later, was our first architectural response to pandemics, and incorporated all these ideas, but coincided exactly with the development of germ theory, which happened in the mid-1850s. Blackwell's Island, designed by James Renwick in New York City in the East River, had all of these elements of light, air, water, isolation appropriately, but abundant care. And it became the progenitor for colony sanatoriums, hospitals further. It is currently standing as a ruin on Roosevelt Island, a beloved ruin for everything that it represents. Interestingly, W. Wheeler Smith, who was an early apprentice of James Renwick, was asked to create a new building, the William J. Sims Operating Theater, adjunct to Roosevelt Hospital, also in New York City. Roosevelt Hospital designed in high-style Gothic revival, but not Wheeler, even though he was trained under Renwick in that particular style. The descriptions of Wheeler's building were formidable, that the design appeared neither frugal nor lacking expressiveness, but serious and straightforward. And most important, that it evoked the high place of medical science in determining its form. It had all of these abundant features of light, air, large voluminous spaces, clear water, and abundant care. But it was devoid of decoration. It was devoid of all the elements that could harbor bacteria and germs that were now beginning to be well known. The building on the interior, this is an early depiction of the entrance lobby, had elements that predated others, such as ramps for wheelchairs and for moving people around, but had no hard corners. Everything was a smooth corner, hard surfaces, easy to keep clean. It was the world's first aseptic hospital, meaning bacteria could not actually survive in the hospital. Where the business end of the hospital took place in the actual operating theater, it looks very, very modern for an 1890s buildings. And in the same vein, all the surfaces hard, easy to keep clean, and very modern. The building still stands, no longer for its originally intended purpose, but certainly all of those elements could be put back into service without difficulty. Again, this idea of collective consciousness. So people who weren't hospitalized had the option of living within quarantine communities where these same features and living outdoors would take place. These became most prevalent during 1918 and afterwards during the Spanish flu epidemic, this one in Lawrence, Mass, but not unlike quarantine hospitals across the United States. You'll notice the doughboy, a soldier from World War I, wearing a mask. For a generation, this persisted because, frankly, these were the only known curatives for many of the conditions that we were facing. Masking is, again, nothing new. And in fact, during 1918 and afterwards, masks were required for public transportation, no different than they are now. This is an admonishment by the conductor for the gentleman without the mask that he may not enter that trolley. If he did enter it, he would be reminded that when you get home, keep your bedroom windows open, because that was, again, the only known curative for the diseases that we were facing. At this point, buildings, not only in their form, but also the building codes that govern them, were beginning to reflect these more deeply embedded ideas about how to keep people safe. There's this long-standing story that New York City apartments are overly hot, and maybe a long-standing joke that's because the tradespeople didn't exactly know how to size the equipment. Far from it. The building codes from 1918 forward in New York City, which served as a model for the rest of the country, actually required that the bedrooms and living areas of apartments in the Northeast would be fully heated throughout the dead of winter with the windows fully open. And now, of course, we have other elements to offset the abundance of air coming in from the outdoors. And so the apartments seem very, very hot by comparison. But that was actually a building code, and a very advanced building code standard. Likewise, sanitary systems became congealed in one place with the kinds of hard surfaces, easy to clean, rounded edges that were reflective of the William J. Sims operating theater. So all of this stuff of a piece that began continuously to evolve until World War II. At that point, all of these elements that were embedded in buildings that allowed for a great deal of light, a great deal of air, a great deal of volume within the spaces began to change. We moved submarine technology in from World War II. When we did that, we moved nature out of our buildings. Buildings began to take different forms, and that worsened in 1973 after the first oil embargo, when we actually shut down systems. We lowered ceilings, we closed windows, we blocked out light. We did a great deal of damage, not irreparable though, to buildings that had these great features that could be put into surface perfectly for the conditions that we're facing, for instance, today. So we need to be aware of overzealous responses to conditions that we're facing. One of the benefits that we have now that we have not had in the past is we can make quantum leaps based on science, technology, and the continuation of benchmarks that prove out things that we've known intrinsically for thousands of years, but now can actually prove it out on paper. We understand the trajectory of the atmospherics surrounding transfer of disease. We can trace that with computational fluid dynamics. We also understand much better the nuances of how disease moves even in small spaces. We've known for some time that high humidity is better in buildings because it slows the transmission of droplets across a room. However, what hasn't been so clear is that the nuclei of the disease actually fall out of suspension. And while the droplets may quickly fall to the floor within 10 seconds or so, the nuclei stay suspended in the air. We can measure those now, though, and we can see exactly how they move, so that while the larger water droplets, generally over 5 microns, are falling, the smaller nuclei are moving up and spinning around in the air that we're breathing. But we have the technology through HEPA filters and an entire MERV categorization of benefits of a variety of filters to be able to capture particles much smaller than viral particles. So now we're able to study within the spaces that have all these inherent beneficial features, a great deal more information about the insertion of our technological systems to be able to better control and maintain and create safe and healthy environments within our heritage buildings. This is a great study that actually just was published less than a month ago in the American Institute of Physics about catching viral particles during a concert where the musicians are facing the audience, doing that with a series of HEPA filters appropriately placed within the space, and then having a so-called break for cleaning of where the water droplets had fallen of about 25 minutes, same as an intermission, which begins to develop a roadmap of how we can begin to reopen our heritage theaters, our schools, our auditoriums, and other buildings that are so vital to the way that we operate within our communities. So the combination of all of this is extraordinary for us now, but never to lose sight of the benefits that have evolved for us over time that are reflective in our heritage buildings. It brings me back to one of my favorite symbols, a West African mythic bird named Sankofa, which flies forward, carrying an embryo, the seed of an idea, but always with an eye to the past. With that, I'd like to hand off the baton to my colleague, Troy Simpson of 3x3.
Great, thank you so much. Just pull up my screen here. All right, so hopefully that's showing up in the correct place. So thank you, Walter. And thanks, of course, to the Preservation League as well. I'm really glad to be here. It's sort of a new audience for me, so I'm curious to hear what kind of sort of ideas maybe can be shared across at the end of the conversation. So, of course, I think this is a pretty aspirational title. Like as Walter mentioned, we're hoping that we're approaching a post-COVID world, but of course, it's I think important to recognize the sort of circular, repetitive, or at least frequent nature of crises that we sort of face as a global society. And in terms of just my background, I appreciate being briefly introduced. I have a background in green building design and policy, environmental decision-making research, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in environmental psychology at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And I'm a research associate there with the Public Space Research Group at the Center for Human Environments. And my work focuses primarily on public spaces, I guess in the context of parks and plazas and community gardens. That's where most of my work in research is situated, and focusing on like what do we even mean by the term of public space? How is it changing? And it's work that's largely driven by how it is experienced by users. And so some key lenses or themes associated with my research relate to design and environmental gentrification, the relationship between smart cities technologies, or sort of so-called technologies, and the experience, use, and sort of redefinition of experience in public spaces, and also the application of social science research methods to architectural design processes. I'm also in addition to my research work, I'm the director of research and operations at 3x3, which is a Brooklyn-based organization that's focused on equitable and transformative social change, primarily through projects with public sector entities, where we engage with community engagement and facilitation to research, pilot, and test programs with those entities. So as a part of, or in sort of reaction to the sort of unfolding COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that we did as an organization was organize a series of workshops with designers and collaborators that we titled Pressing Pause. And this was recognizing the importance of the moment, I think, to be diligent about the shifting landscape of what is possible, plausible, and probable in terms of the futures, and this, based upon a sort of linear progression of time or consideration of that. But also a really unique moment, that this unraveling allows for a reconsideration of what is preferable or preferable, and how that fits into the broader landscape. So like to Walter's point before, I think about the importance of not becoming sort of just purely reactionary to a pandemic in terms of how we interact with the built environment and other programs and policies, but recognizing at the same time the role it plays as an inflection point. So we can ask at this moment, like, what do we want to keep? What have we lost? What have we gained? And how do we want to move forward across, so many different aspects of our society: transportation, family and intergenerational connections, economic and housing insecurity, of course, inequity in healthcare, and the nature of essential work, and so forth. So I think, I don't propose to have all of the answers to these questions, but I'm hoping that it may be interesting to review some of the epistemological foundations of at least the way that I engage with environmental psychology as an academic discipline, but also as a practical tool for understanding human connections to built and natural environments, with the hope that this might spark some ideas about how to think about preservation in this moment. So environmental psychology as a field is interdisciplinary, right? As a subset of psychology that is primarily focused on understanding experience from an individual psychological sense as a starting point, as opposed to a collective or cultural whole where a lot of narratives can be sort of washed over, right? So it arose in reaction to some of the challenges associated with the application of natural science research methods to the study of human experience in context. So at its core, environmental psychology explores this sort of dynamic relationship between people, place, and space to understand how our behavior and cultural values shape our environment and how they in turn shape and affect us. So importantly, it's not just about people and ecology or sustainability or the environmental impacts that the spaces that we inhabit have on people, but rather taking a view that, people are in fact connected to and woven together and co-creating experience and meaning. So the concepts of place and space then are important to define. I think we can think of space as the field in which places with meaning are constructed, and insofar as they are material. And so a crucial aspect of this understanding is the iterative nature of this sort of formation and change of place meanings over time, right? So on one side, people shaping places, and that we construct buildings, we define how they look, how they're configured, what's allowable to do in them and at what times. Simultaneously, places shape people, right? So the environmental cues, affordances, and so forth tell us socially, interpersonally, what's possible, and also from a material sense, what is physically possible, right? Is there a place to sit? Is there a bathroom? Is there the affordance of privacy? And so these dynamics are important to the facilitation of behavior and health impacts, as I think Jill's going to be talking about more as well, but also reproducing cultural and social dynamics. And so these lenses are both true and in tension with each other in varying degrees at all time. So an important takeaway here, I think, is that the environment or the spaces that we're interested in designing or redesigning or preserving, can't be studied separately from behavior and experience. A brief example is, when I'm teaching undergraduates, I ask them or describe to them how, a lot of them have become full-time students at home over the last year. So this like breaking apart of a lot of the existing norms and processes that were associated with those identities and experiences. And I asked them to think about what ways their current environments, many of them back at home living with their parents and so forth, either support their student experiences, do they have access to internet and access to daylight and so forth, or in contrast, hinder that experience, maybe the sort of introduction of limited privacy or increased noise and distractions and so forth. And also the intersection there of what ways is it possible at the sort of user scale to relate to or moderate or modulate those dynamics from structural and psychological sort of perspectives. So these place-space dynamics then relate to their successes and not as students or with their identities as students and friends and family members. So with this sort of consideration, right, of space being effectively like unbounded dimensions within which we exist, and place being a sort of individual and shared set of meanings that we construct about the environments that we inhabit, there are different genealogies of place and space. So environmental psychology and the take that I'm presenting is essentially one. So it's important to note that, I think. But I think for this group, it would hopefully be useful to highlight a couple sort of broad conceptual lenses applied to research in theory on the study of place and space. The first of which is social production of space in contrast with social construction of space. So if we've first considered this distinction between space and place, the social production perspective can help us to think about like the history and political economy associated with it, right? So what are the governments and the people and the historical sort of narratives in terms of how they are conceived and created? What are those narratives that are then transformed into the materiality of these buildings and physical environments? So that's to say, social reproduction refers to the conditions necessary to reproduce social class. And in this context, like, is defined as how everyday activities, beliefs, and practices, as well as social and spatial structures that we create, right, transmit social inequality and social dynamics so over time. So we can think of social production of space as a kind of top-down approach to the creation and perpetuation of class and context. And that's borne out in the very sort of physical nature of the world that we inhabit. In contrast to that, I have a quotation here. In contrast to that, the social construction of space, or another lens, is that which emphasizes the role of social interaction and symbols and language and how they can form and give meaning to physical space. So the focus there through this lens is on individual and collective embodied experiences in meaning making, right? So methodologies here or through this lens emphasize the sort of interplay and tension between groups and what it feels like to navigate and redefine space. So, I mean, as I mentioned, some of my research has been on community gardens in New York City. And if we were studying a community garden through this lens, we could try to understand how the different ideas among garden members could be in conflict with each other, and how they shape their sort of individual spaces and how they negotiate collectively. What does it mean to have a garden space in the middle of the city? And so how that then translates into these material realities, right? And so with that in mind, or with these perspectives in mind, as I mentioned, most of what I study or focus on are aspects of public space. And I think we can define public spaces through maybe, first a somewhat narrow topographical lens in terms of the type of space, a park or recreation space. And at least in doing so, recognize them as sites where sort of the desires and needs of people are either seen or not. But we can also view public spaces instead through a procedural perspective, which emphasizes the role that they play in broader discourse. And so from a procedural perspective, any space then that's put to use at a given time for collective action or debate can be thought of as public space. And we can think about all the tensions and all the types of public space that are in tension in the context of COVID-19. But this is largely about a procedural perspective that can highlight the role and importance historically significant buildings in lived experiences of users. Like, why is a particular space perceived as in a certain way? Why is it perceived or preserved in a certain way? What is emphasized through the processes of decision-making and eventual construction of them or maintenance of them? So, using this lens as a foundation, I think, again, thinking of public spaces through this more broad lens of being driven by and defined by the types of experiences that occur within them, and how those experiences are in tension with each other. I think a useful a framework that I wanted to present to you guys that hopefully could be useful in the context of historic preservation in particular, is a series of questions that you can ask about particular sites as a means of guiding the execution and also evaluation of design and programming. Particularly, I think, as we seek to reflect and reposition our use of various types of spaces, moving to a hopefully, post-COVID-19 context. So they have these 5 sort of propositions or considerations that could be applied at a very granular sort of individual scale of an individual site. The first consideration is distributive justice, right? So you can ask, like, how are wealth, reward, benefits, and burdens distributed? This can be looked at from a larger perspective in terms of like the spatial geographic distribution of various types of space. If this is, a park or plaza, like how many of them are there in a given area? But also through the lens of affordability and access, right? What is the degree to which people have access to these different types of environments, and asking ultimately the question of, like, who is served through the presentation or preservation and accessibility of a particular site. The second consideration is recognition, right? So it's very important, I think, in the context of historical connections to meaning and identity, to think about this sort of formation and expression of collective identities at a particular site. Like, so what is either amplified or stigmatized, and what types of activities are supported in the design and programming related decisions with regard to a particular place. So what histories are elevated versus not, and how does that translate into day-to-day programming? The third is interactional justice and encounter. So what is the quality of interpersonal interaction in a situation or place, right? So is the particular site welcoming of meaningful social interaction? What are the rules of conduct? Are there explicit and implicit materials, signage, operation, or signals that communicate rules to users about who is welcome and how they should interact with each other? And care and repair is the fourth one, right? So this is about the process of care and repair for the space, what is emphasized, and if it's either preserving certain aspects of design or maintaining them over time, and what that signals. Particularly relevant, I think, in a COVID context, right, is what signals of safety and care are being communicated explicitly and visually related to elements such as air quality and social distancing and staffing, if staffing is involved, the presence of PPE and so forth. And also the this form of care can be connected to other problems related to redistribution and recognition and interaction and encounter. But it's important to recognize sort of different configurations of care as they're influenced by particular ideologies and policy frameworks. And then finally, procedural justice, right? So this is the question about individual spaces or buildings or sites. What are the processes by which decision-making sort of unfolds in terms of the outcomes, right? Allocation of resources, provision of maintenance, establishment of rules and norms, but the processes themselves from the perspective of inclusion and the perception of fairness as well. So hopefully these, I feel like this is a little bit maybe theoretical or abstract, but these particular lenses, I think, taking into account a sort of place, space, context or framework may be useful as a means of interrogating how we move through, hopefully, the end of the pandemic. And so that's my talk, and I'll be happy to hand it off to Jill.
Thank you, Troy. There we go. I think we're all set. So in 1948, the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. More than a half century later, this definition of health was explored again by the Historic England in their study on well-being in the historic environment. Not surprisingly, conclusions noted that physical, mental, and social well-being all have an impact on health and the quality of life. But of particular interest were findings documenting the significant role that historic buildings played in the wellness equation. Research by the University College London also supported the link specifically between heritage sites and mental wellness. It showed that contact with a heritage site, whether as a visitor or volunteer, frequently improved mood and even promoted a sense of citizenship among isolated and disadvantaged groups. Sorry. Yet with all this research on buildings and wellness, discussions of reoccupancy have, for the most part, focused solely on physical well-being. If there's one takeaway from this presentation, although I hope that there's many more than one, it would be that as stewards of the built environment, we acknowledge, integrate, and promote the vitally important role of mental, emotional, and social well-being for a more holistic approach to wellness, health, environments in the future of our historic buildings as we move into a post-pandemic era. So this is the restoration and expansion master plan for Philbrook Art Museum that our office took. And this is one of two case studies that I'm going to present. The Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I believe is one of the most unique and beautiful museums in the US. It sits on an expanse of 23 acres of gardens pouring out from the historic villa. The villa portion of Philbrook, built in 1927 for oilman Wade Phillips, is a 72-room Italian Renaissance style home designed by the Kansas City architect Edward Beulah Delk, and it was a focal point of the master plan development. The restoration and expansion master plan was undertaken as part of Philbrook's new strategic plan with the goal to rethink connecting with art and connecting with community, and to open the museum doors to a wider and more diverse audience. Walter discussed features and systems that developed throughout history in response to health and well-being, features which definitely give heritage structures a leg up in a post-pandemic world. That said, we have over the years corrupted these features in the name of energy savings or during adaptive reuse or purely in the name of modernization and change in fashion. Our work at Philbrook looked to reveal new and embellish the thoughtful attributes of wellness incorporated by the original architects and then consider sensitive refinements from there. As often found with museum buildings, modifications were undertaken to design spaces for art and not for people. Walls were constructed to block original windows, causing unhealthy microclimates between the windows and the false walls. Plans included removal of these walls to restore healthy indoor air quality and allow natural daylight and ventilation back into the villa galleries. Sir Bannister Fletcher, A History of Architecture, shows examples of how every building up until the 20th century incorporated the healing effects of biophilia, whether this was through form, through ornament, or direct connection to the outdoors through windows, skylights, transoms. These are all elixirs for wellness that our heritage buildings possess. Our historic buildings are also often filled with natural, tactile, and beautiful materials and finishes, such as woods, fabrics, ornamental plaster, decorative paints, and stenciling, all of which support mental well-being. We need to be careful that we don't, in the name of eliminating germs, cover up, or worse, remove these embellishments that sustain emotional well-being. Often ornament becomes an easy victim of a reactionary response, and the concern is that this will be so with sanitizing our environments, decisions which we'll one day regret and see as overzealous. An important goal for equity and inclusion on this project was to reach the people, the museum's own backyard. So often museums jump over these people in an attempt to reach sort of a quote unquote museum audience. In order to reach a wider audience, the master plan looked to make the museum less precious and more accessible. The design team curated multiple visioning and planning sessions with museum staff, board members, and community representatives to ensure that the master plan captured Philbrook's aspiration for a more innovative, diverse, and inclusive programming and exhibits. This goal manifested in myriad design decisions, but included direct and unencumbered connection to the gardens, moving exhibits and programming outside, removing fencing and gates around the museum, and creating a new museum entry sequence that is more accessible and welcoming for visitors that arrive by public transportation. This eliminated the need for these visitors to walk through what can sometimes appear as a daunting, wealthy neighborhood of mansions in order to enter into the museum, and to be able to make better use of the outside spaces that the museum found were bringing in a far more diverse and inclusive audience. The second project that I'm going to look at was the Art Factory. This is in the Great Falls Historic District. And so the Art Factory, Patterson, is one of the first planned industrial cities in the US. It was planned by Alexander Hamilton and included raceways of water came down through the buildings to harness energy from the Great Falls of the Passaic River to the mills. The mill district contains some of the country's oldest textile mills, and during the Patterson's prosperous time, silk mills, earning Patterson the name Silk City. Patterson was the site of a historic labor unrest that focused on anti-child labor legislation, safety in the workplace, and minimum wage. Environmental stewardship and clean energy, economy, and equity are in the DNA of this mill complex. It therefore seems befitting that our approach for the restoration and adaptive use of the master plan was grounded in the 3 E's of sustainability: environment, equity, and economy. And we always like to add a 4th E, education. Although not new concepts, environment, equity, and economy have now resurfaced as the 3-legged stool of sustainability and wellness standards. In fact, they're the core of the AIA's 2020 policy platform and framework for design excellence. So restoring inherent sustainability, as we said, is a holistic approach to sustainability. And the Art Factory had no shortage of daylight opportunities. Although windows were typically not functioning throughout the complex and skylights had been closed up, transoms and other historic vestiges of light and air were corrupted, covered over, or removed. This complex has undergone little change but these inherently sustainable attributes were lost to deferred maintenance, leaks, and neglect, as opposed to modifications for the building to be used in another way. On the bright side, restoration of these magnificent windows became an opportunity for job training, education, as well as restoring the healthy indoor environment and air quality, which Tom will talk more about. Environmental stewardship was essential given the building's location and relationship to the Passaic River and the Patterson Falls. But beyond typical concerns of flood zones and drainage, Patterson had limited pedestrian access to the protected greenway and parks surrounding the falls, which is now the Great Falls National Historic Park. We worked together with our client, the National Park Service and community, to establish a plan for redeveloping a pathway from the Art Factory to the Great Falls National Historic Park to allow for a better community engagement and use of the park and access to green and environmentally sound areas for play and enjoyment. Another great success of the planning process was approval to reduce parking on site and the inclusion of a privately run trolley system, a far more sustainable solution for a city development and one that allows for the restoration of the cobblestone walkways that run through the complex and use of the exterior spaces for film shoots and public events, and bringing the film industry in to use the space was a significant resource and economic driver for the client. The Art Factory was conceived of as a cooperative work environment with shared services. They have a metal shop, a wood shop, and social gathering spaces. The large open floor plan, wide hallways allow for social distancing, reduced density, flexible workspaces, and movable furnishings. So they have become ideal as a space to reduce quarantine fatigue and allow people a social space for interaction. As a project in the early stages of phased construction, which was done pre-pandemic, there's ample opportunity to tweak the plans to address some simple measures related to touch and to address IEQ issues directly related to reducing transmission. These can include things like touchless entries, capabilities, sliding doors, motion detectors, ADA pads, and other things that can be done by touching with elbows or used as touchless. The direction of the doors can be changed, and restroom doors to be designed to open out so that they're touchless after washing hands. Sinks outside restrooms can be installed, and water bottle fill stations, all things that we would consider more so now post-pandemic as we're working on plans moving forward. Again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I was really happy to see Troy's discussion of just spaces, because really for a holistic project, every project has to take into account diversity, equity, and inclusion to truly be a project that's sustainable and to support wellness both for the occupants and for the communities. Patterson's home to 52 distinct ethnic groups and has one of the highest number of disabled persons in any city. So clearly diversity, equity, and inclusion fell high on the priorities for the adaptive use of these mill buildings. Far too many of Patterson's mill buildings were being chopped up and prioritized for housing, and they were converted to a private use that really didn't allow the community to celebrate its history and its sense of place, which, as noted earlier, began with these mill buildings with Alexander Hamilton. So the development plan that we had for the project included spaces for growing opportunity for community programs for all ages and open the doors to the communities through the arts. So to keep these more in the public realm, even though they were privately owned. Other master plan goals are to promote opportunities for education and job training programs through vocational high schools and various other community programs for the un- or underemployed residents of Patterson. Hiring local workers for construction projects, security, facilities management, and staffing operations will all contribute to neighborhood revitalization and job creation. And interesting, the pandemic has made it clear that the way we occupy our spaces need to be re-envisioned as far more people are working from home. Traditionally, people lived where they worked, as we know with historic buildings and main streets that people lived above or behind the store for throughout our history. And top shops in Paris where work studios were up in the attic floor with living below. A live-work arrangement was an integral part of the programming for the master plan for the art factory. And while this was allowed in the Great Falls Historic District, and it's often allowed in a lot of art districts, it's not allowed in many jurisdictions or zoning districts. One of the challenges moving forward post-pandemic will likely be the need for code and zoning changes to allow for alternative live-work arrangements. We look at every time we're in each other's rooms through Zoom calls, and we see the unlikely workspaces, an enlarged closet in a New York City apartment, windowless basement. So it becomes all the more important, if this is going to be our life post-pandemic, that we reconsider our live-work arrangements. We also want to have a question after the pandemic is, will it lead to a permanent change in the way that we both live, work, and play? And will new public spaces become essential for social interaction as people begin to work from home? And where better to have these social spaces than in our historic buildings, which do define our community and who we are? The other question is, will reduced transportation become a norm and a need for extended sidewalks, increased pedestrian traffic, as well as extending outdoors become the city and town planning challenge? So I want to close with a really interesting an important challenge that seems to be coming up to local historic preservation commissions. We're seeing an increased number of applications for modification of historic buildings for permanent or semi-permanent additions to allow for whether it be indoor, outdoor dining or for new programming, for occupancy limitations. And this includes things like removals of windows and doors to allow for takeout windows or pass-throughs or outdoor dining, or sometimes even the removal of an entire storefront to allow for a connection of the inside and outside for these dining. We've also seen a lot of things for constructions of porches and porticos and overhangs and other weather protection as people are lining up outside for timed entries. An installation of large visible through-wall ventilation systems to address upgrades to HVAC, and numerous other alterations in response to occupancy and life in the post-pandemic era. These are applications that would normally not be approved because they remove historic fabric, damage historic materials, or require significant modifications in design to the structure. The goals of historic preservation have been to retain historic fabric and original features and limit changes to historic buildings. However, these requests bring to the forefront some of the questions being asked in the field of historic preservation. Should we be more flexible in allowing changes to our historic buildings in order to allow businesses and cultural institutions to remain in operation? We need to keep our main streets alive. We want to keep our businesses going. If so, what should these new guidelines or standards look like? Keeping historic buildings in use by adapting them to current needs is vitally important. That said, we always know that technological advancements follow need, and we can expect that new materials, products, and systems will become available in response to our reoccupancy needs if we wait patiently for them. It's important that we think clearly and collectively about the refinements and alterations, that we take the long view in this and not be reactionary. As recommended by current standards, let's consider reversibility. I suggest we remember the past modifications. Walter mentioned these earlier, done in the name of energy efficiency during the oil embargo, that we're now working so hard to undo. And that our responses to our heritage buildings in a post-pandemic era should be well conceived and not reactionary. And I'm going to now turn this over to Tom Newbold for his section.
Thanks, Jill. Today I'm going to speak about systems in heritage buildings that have an impact on our health and wellness. And I'll be talking about HVAC, plumbing, and lighting systems. And I think you'll probably notice that there was a correlation there between Walter's talk, where we're covering air, water, and light. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about, historic buildings pre-pandemic. Historic buildings tended to get a bit of a pass. We were really leaning toward minimum intervention in the buildings and doing what was kind of a code minimum requirement, so that we would reduce the disruption to the building materials and do things that the building envelope could sustain. And I think that now in the, this sort of post-pandemic era, people are a lot more aware of the relationship between their health and the buildings that they live, work, and play in. And they're paying attention to these concepts like indoor air quality and water quality, and recognize that a healthy building is not only one that provides human health benefits, but also is healthy for the planet by being environmentally responsible and energy efficient. And I really think that people are going to demand more from their built environment, and historic buildings aren't getting that free pass any longer. Of course, lighting design could be a full session in itself, so I really just want to touch on how lighting impacts our health. Through research, we know that light is important for our health and well-being. It affects our level of alertness, and it also can adapt and stimulate our biological clocks, as well as our psychological state. Light exposure is particularly significant when you consider the role that it plays in sleep, and given that the Institute of Medicine reports that about 50 to 70 million US adults have chronic sleep disorders, and that these disorders are associated with the increased risk of certain diseases, including diabetes, obesity, depression, heart attack, hypertension, and stroke. And as we unfortunately know all too well these days, these are all comorbidities that make things like COVID-19 all that more lethal. Light also has an important effect on the production of melatonin, which is an essential sleep-promoting hormone. There was an interesting study by the Cleveland Clinic COVID-19 registry that revealed that melatonin usage was associated with a nearly 30% reduction in the likelihood of testing positive for COVID. Unfortunately, not all light is good light. I think we all know a few minutes working under the wrong lighting can kill productivity through eye strain, headaches, poor mood, poor concentration, and this can lead to problems like absenteeism and job dissatisfaction. So besides the obvious issue of not enough light for visual acuity, there are a number of other lighting related issues such as glare, lighting that would have a negative impact on our biological clock, high energy use, and solar heat gain. Exposure to daylight has much to offer, and daylight has been shown to provide numerous health benefits, both physical and emotional. And daylight also tends to enhance the aesthetics of the space and can reduce the amount of energy that is consumed by electric lights. But in order to harvest the benefits of daylight, we have to make sure that visual discomfort from things like glare is minimized. And if daylight isn't available, then lighting should be designed to provide a comfortable and well-lit environment while being energy efficient. The lighting system ideally should incorporate some artificial circadian lighting design that really can mimic that light-dark cycle of sunlight and offer the same kind of benefits that we get from natural light. Many of the buildings we consider historic were built when artificial light was limited, and these buildings relied heavily on natural light and had features like large windows and skylights and glazed transoms. And over time, a lot of these features on the older buildings were omitted as artificial light sources became predominant, and we started adding things like mechanical systems. So with an increased awareness of health in buildings, I would argue that historic buildings really can lead the way by retaining those features that provide natural light, working on things like reopening the blocked historic windows and skylights so that we can reestablish natural light and ventilation, utilize light-controlled devices on historic buildings where they were appropriate, install automated daylighting controls, and potentially using appropriately designed and installed window treatments. Moving on to water. Water, of course, is key to our health. And the human body is about 60% water, and the consensus in the medical community is that we should be drinking about 1 to 2 liters of water per day. And if the drinking water contains unsafe levels of contaminants, it really can have a number of negative health effects, such as gastrointestinal illness, nervous system or reproductive system damage, and chronic diseases like cancer. Unfortunately, there's a long list of pollutants that can be found in our drinking water, and they fall into 4 major source categories, including industry and agriculture, human and animal waste, human treatment or water treatment and distribution, and other natural sources. There's a number of ways to treat water, and the proper treatment depends on the type of contaminant. But the options would include things like particulate filtration, which is good for removing solid matter in the water, carbon filters, which is good for removing odors and some chemicals, reverse osmosis water filtration, which is effective at eliminating metals, salt, bacteria, viruses, and dissolved solids. One of the problems with reverse osmosis systems is that for every gallon of water that you treat, you can be rejecting up to 3 gallons of wastewater. Doesn't really fall into the sustainable category in my mind. There's ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, which is effective at neutralizing bacteria, viruses, and cysts that might be in the water. And interestingly enough, UV treatment doesn't chemically change the water, it just adds energy to the water, and it neutralizes the microbes. So there are advantages and different disadvantages to the various treatment options. So it's really key to have water tests done so that you can come up with a proper solution for your building. And often it's a combination of multiple technologies that all work together. And as with anything else, it's really important that if you are putting these systems in, that you have an ongoing program of testing and maintenance to make sure that they continue to provide clean and safe water. Moving on to air, indoor air quality, which really refers to the air quality within buildings and structures. And since humans breathe in somewhere between 11 and 15,000 liters of air per day, and we spend about 90% of our time indoors, it's really important that our indoor air quality be good. And that studies have found the concentration of some pollutants indoors can be 2 to 5 times higher than the outdoor concentrations. Like water, there's a wide range of pollutants that can make it into the indoor air we breathe, and some are from exterior sources and some are from interior sources. Some are particulates and some are gases. One one particular pollutant that really has dominated our lives for the past year is a virus. And one of the main ways in which viruses and bacteria spread among humans is by respiratory droplets. We produce these respiratory droplets when we speak, we sing, cough, sneeze, that sort of thing. And these droplets can potentially contain infectious pathogens. And when the droplets are formed, a lot of them are fairly large and they drop out of the air pretty quickly. And that's what, the 6-foot social distancing is all about. There are a number of ways that, these droplets can remain airborne for longer periods of time, and they can travel considerable distances propelled on air currents. And it's really those particles that are of concern to HVAC designers. All of these pollutants contribute to a range of negative health outcomes, such as asthma, allergies, and upper respiratory illnesses, not to mention colds and flus. Also, air quality issues can lead to sick building syndrome, which is where there's no particular disease or cause that can be identified, and yet there are acute health effects that are linked with spending time in that building. There are a variety of measures that can be taken to improve indoor air quality, and I'm just going to touch on a few that have gotten a lot of attention lately. One measure you've been hearing about is increasing outside air ventilation rates. If the air inside isn't adequately diluted with outside air, the pollutants can accumulate to levels that pose health and comfort problems. And outdoor air can enter and leave a building by various means, including infiltration, natural ventilation, and mechanical ventilation. Most buildings with HVAC systems rely on mechanical ventilation. The most notable exception in northern climates is churches, which still frequently rely on natural ventilation. Codes dictate the amount of outside air that must be delivered to a space depending on the type of occupancy and the number of occupants. With COVID, the recommendation was to increase the ventilation rates by 130%. Increasing the outside air means potentially larger intake louvers on the building and possibly the addition of exhaust louvers. And of course, this is always tricky when we're dealing with a historic building. And the additional outside air will require more heating and cooling because of the air being brought in, and that could potentially result in more energy consumption. As air moves through a building's HVAC system, the air filters trap and collect particles such as dust, allergen, and microorganisms. And air filters have a rating system called MERV, which rates how effectively the filter stops dust and other contaminants. Filters with high MERV ratings trap small particles more effectively than filters with lower MERV ratings. Most older air handling systems had filters that were rated for MERV 7 or 8. New recommendations are to use a minimum of MERV 13 filters, and these are effective at capturing the smaller air particles that are irritating to our respiratory system, and also capturing those respiratory droplets that might be circulated in the air system. Again, the drawback for filters with higher MERV ratings is that they tend to create more resistance to airflow. They have a higher pressure drop, and it may not be advisable to simply try and swap MERV 13 filters with MERV 7 filters because you may be having an impact on the airflow. Relative humidity has been shown to have an impact on human health in several ways. And scientists have found that humidity levels in the 40 to 60% range are optimal for the human body because they enhance our ability to fight off infection. And studies have also found that many viruses, including the coronavirus, decay faster when the relative humidity is closer to 60%. The amount of moisture in the air also has an influence on how far those respiratory droplets will travel. If the air is dry, then the moisture in those droplets will evaporate more quickly, and the particles become microscopic, and so they will stay aloft longer. You see, humidification is one of the biggest challenges in historic preservation. When you have a building with no insulation or vapor barrier and a single layer of glass in the windows, there are plenty of surfaces that are going to be cool enough in the winter to be below the dew point temperature of humidified air, and condensation is likely to occur. So we always have to take a careful look at a building envelope before we start adding humidity. Displacement ventilation is a method that is intended to improve ventilation effectiveness. Most HVAC systems use what is called mixed air ventilation. If you look at the diagram on the left, you see that air is discharged from the ceiling diffusers at a high velocity, and they entrain the surrounding air, and it mixes the air in the room thoroughly so that you have an even temperature distribution. The problem is that you also have an even distribution of contaminants in the air. A solution to this is a method called displacement ventilation. And displacement ventilation, it introduces the air at a low velocity near the floor, so that there's a minimum amount of mixing in the room, and the air, as it flows across the floor, when it finds a warm body, which would be a human, buoyancy causes the air to rise up, and that person then feels comfortable because they have the cool air moving past them. But more importantly, it's carrying the contaminants from that person, they're breathing and speaking. It's carrying it up and out of other people's breathing zone up to the ceiling where it can be exhausted from the room. And this approach has been found to have a major impact on the health and performance of students and teachers in classrooms. Unfortunately, displacement ventilation requires larger and more prominent supply grills in the room. As you can see, there's an example of one in the lower right corner. And depending on the goal of the historic preservation project, the aesthetic impact of this just may not be acceptable. I'm going to talk quickly about a project that really benefited from a restoration project that was aimed at restoring a lot of the intrinsic design elements that made it comfortable when it was built. It's Christ Church in Bronxville, New York, and it was the last parish church that was designed it was that church that Bertram Goodhue was involved with, and he supervised the siting and the general plans, but he died before the church was completed. So the complex is comprised of several buildings, which are anchored by the Goodhue designed sanctuary, and the adjoining buildings host functions like an auditorium, church office, and preschool. The two larger buildings on the campus, known as Kensington and Sagamore, were converted from residential apartment buildings to serve as offices and preschool. Over the years, the church and related buildings underwent changes and suffered some benign neglect. In the sanctuary, Goodhue designed operable pivot windows for the clear story were made inoperable when art glass windows were commissioned. Also, there was protective glazing that was installed over the stained glass windows, and it diminished the natural light and ventilation in the sanctuary. In the undercroft, the ceiling had been drastically lowered to conceal HVAC ductwork. The lowered ceiling diminished natural light and ventilation and made the space feel closed in. In Kensington and Sagamore, the original windows were single glazed and had fallen into disrepair. The multi-year restoration project removed the protective glazing from the sanctuary. And what was really interesting is that the non-operable clear story art glass windows were converted back to being operable by working with the original artist and a metal fabricator to develop new operable frames to hold the art glass. The windows were restored, and in Kensington and Sagamore, they were replaced with good quality operable wood windows which was all intended to optimize levels of daylight and natural ventilation. Lighting was converted to LED, and it was designed to balance the ambient light and task lighting, reduce glare, and provide more visual acuity. This whole combination of improvements to the building really made the spaces more comfortable. The parish really enjoyed the changes, and the rector, who was a huge fan of all these changes, spoke of them frequently. In a subsequent project that happened to coincide with the onset of the pandemic, the parish wanted to install a central air conditioning system in Kensington and Sagamore, and we reviewed the various options and came up with a solution that provided ventilation rate at 130% above code minimum, energy recovery units so that we could do this more energy efficiently, displacement ventilation, and we used MERV 14 filters. The system hasn't been installed yet, and hopefully there's more to come on that soon. In closing, I just wanted to say, while the health and wellness of people in buildings is really of paramount importance, historic character really, it still matters. And when we're looking at these buildings, we need to come up with elegant solutions and temper our reactions so the buildings can be preserved. We don't want to overreact and install systems that will ultimately do more harm than good. And as always, we need to consider what we do now may turn out needing to be undone in the future. So we want to preserve as much of the original building fabric as possible. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Erin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for this great afternoon's webinar presentations. And again, these are all topics we're thinking about in the preservation community. And I really think just, I mean, everybody is so much more aware of air quality and in our environment right now. Which is always both a challenge and an opportunity. So I think I wanted to see if we had any question and answers or questions that we could give answers to from our audience. There's nothing yet in the Q&A box, but now is your chance. We have, we're trying to wrap this up in a few minutes, but there is a moment for a question or two if any panelist has a question. And I'll ask one actually of you, Tom. You mentioned, that you have that project, that Kensington project that is ongoing, and one of the questions I had is, has that changed because it, started in the pandemic, and as you're working on it, did you have to shift what you were doing, or is that something you're kind of working on right now?
Well, really, the consideration of the project started at the very early stages of the pandemic, and what is really interesting in doing all this research is that nothing we're recommending now is something that would be undone or a bad idea in the future. And as Walter was saying, the pandemics, we may be done with this one or close to done with this one for now, but we don't know what else is coming. And I think that the health benefits of the improvements that we're talking about, are going to be lasting and are important. So.
Thank you. And I think that, as preservationists and as people, who spend a lot of time in historic and existing buildings, and we've had Walter and Jill present at many of our different programs over the years, I think the consistent message is look to what worked in the past and what solutions your buildings already contain. Without question and answers, do any of you have any final closing thoughts that we can wrap up the afternoon with? And anything in particular you want to say to in conclusion?
No, I would echo what you've just mentioned so clear-eyed, Aaron, that these features already exist in heritage buildings because we sought early on to protect ourselves, and our buildings were a physical envelope around us within our communities. And they also established the means not only for us to live individually and independently, but collectively as a community. I think that the discussions brought forward by Troy, by Jill, by Tom, all coalesce into a large thought that can continue to evolve about how we make the best use of what we already have in our hands, or how we rediscover how much that we have, and then incorporate the benefits of science and technology and the benefits of wellness and the exterior environment in our social engagements. So it's an absolutely stunning way for our profession that we all love so much to continue to move forward and to be exceedingly relevant effectively forever.
And I'll just add to that quickly is, one of our things that we sometimes forget when we're reacting to whether it was the oil embargo or a pandemic or anything like that, is that our historic buildings are still here and still part of our community for a reason. And and Troy sort of hit on it when we talked a lot about people in place. And people in place is an enormous part of wellness. And we sometimes get wrapped up in the moment of, are we saving energy? Are we cleaning our buildings? Are we sanitizing them? And we forget that buildings are for people, and people use buildings. And that connection, the people connection, needs to stay at the forefront of our decisions moving forward, because that's a constant that will always be there.
That, I think, is an excellent way to wrap up this afternoon's webinar. And thank you all so very much for taking the time to share your expertise and your thoughts with us today. I'll let everybody know that we will have this webinar on our website. So if you want to go back and revisit any of the very informative and thought-provoking questions and points that were presented today, you can do that. And stay tuned for upcoming League webinars. This is one of our Future of Preservation webinar series. We have more coming up, and again, if you liked this, please consider joining us, becoming a member, making a donation. That helps us be able to keep providing these great opportunities to you all. And please follow us on social media. And again, next Thursday, April 21st, I think that's actually Wednesday, is our next Wednesday, April 21st, is our Pillar Awards. So that's free. You can register and have a great evening celebrating some excellent historic preservationists. Have a great afternoon, everybody. And we will see you soon at an upcoming Preservation League event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.